Hey everybody, let me try that again. Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Geesh, I can't even speak. Okay, I've got the Gemini T Pro from Cougar. Okay, so this is actually the Pro. So if we look over here, you can see there is a Gemini T and a Gemini T Pro. So it has these glass wings, so it looks like these side panels here sort of swing out. And it has the RGB synchronization functionality. That's a lot of words there. So ASUS, Gigabyte, ASRock, whatever you call it, and MSI, it works with all of those to synchronize with your motherboard if you're into the RGB stuff. So looking at the specifications here, let's see. Okay, it is a mid-tower. We've got mini ITX, micro ATX, ATX, and CEB. So we've got some fairly large motherboard capabilities here. Let's see what else. Cooling fan support. So it looks like there's one 120 millimeter fan pre-installed, but you can go up to three 120s or two 140s if you want. Top, you've got space for three 120s or two 140s, just like the front. Rear, we've got a 120, which is pre-installed, so that's included. And there's a looks like there's some space for a couple of 120s on the side. So we'll see that when we get the case opened up. So total number of fans, you've got 9 possible. Water cooling support. Front, we've got 360, 280, 240, 140, 120. So the takeaway there is we can go up to a 360 on the front, but there's a little asterisk there, so we'll have to see what those mean. Same thing on the side. Top, you can go up to 360. Oh, another little asterisk. So it looks like we've got some things that have to move around a little bit if you want to use those radiators. In this case, graphics card length maximum, you can go up to 400 millimeters. CPU cooler height, if you go with an air cooler, it's 170 millimeters. Maximum PSU, that's usually not a big deal. Onboard lighting system, it's the Trelux Lighting with addressable RGB LEDs and dynamic lighting effects in the front and top panels. Cable management, yes, of course. I haven't seen a case that really didn't have cable management, but anyway, on to some more exciting stuff here on the side. Okay, so this sort of explains what this Trelux Lighting is. So it's their new lighting technology that provides Gemini Pro T with powerful lighting system of its own. So 3 long RGB powered lenses cover the front. So I think that's these little features right here. It looks like there's some across the top also. Similar to what you have if you saw my review on some of the other Cougar cases, mainly the Conquer 2. It has the same type of an effect, I believe. Let's see, you can control directly through the front panel button. It also works connected to a Cougar Core Box V2. So, okay, so that's just basically your RGB lighting effects. Glass wings here. 2 massive gullwing tempered glass side panels. So that'll be interesting. Let's see, okay, vertical GPU support. So if you want to put a vertical GPU in there, oh, it even says it right there. Up to 400, intelligent cooling up to 9 fans, and 3 water cooling. You know, I've got to figure out where those asterisks were over here. Okay, I didn't really go back to those and look at them. Okay, so, and this is in regard to the water cooling support. So front and side panels, please choose either front or side to install a radiator. And the second one is top panel, please choose either top or front to install a 360. So it looks like you can either put a 360 in the top or the front, but not both. But I'll confirm that when I get it opened up. So looks like we've got several different languages. So let me get this thing opened up and let's take it out of the box. All right, so here it is out of the box. If anyone's asking, that little piece of tape up there, that lets me know when I'm shooting video where the top of my image is. So I always make sure I keep that out of the image when I have the camera on the tripod. So that's why that is on the wall. Okay, so here it is. Typical heavy styrofoam end caps, and it's in a large bag. So let me get that thing out of that bottom end cap. All right, so here it is out of the box. It still has all the protective plastic on it. I need to get that off. But with all this glass, it's really going to be, and you can see right there how reflective it is with the plastic. But these are those little sections that sort of show off that light show. There's 3 across the top, 3 across the front. And this fell out. I have to figure out where it goes. When I was taking it out of the bag, it fell out. Anyway, you can see all the way through the case. So there's glass on both sides. And there's the back of the case. Here's the section where the expansion slots are for the vertical GPU, if you want to go that route. So there's the plastic off, at least off the outside. There's actually plastic on the inside, so let's see how these open. Oh, that's nice. Oh, I see. It's a magnetic somewhere in here. That's very nice. Okay, so both sides open up and they close. That is really cool. All right, so let me get the plastic off from the inside. I like the way the hinges, when you open the side here, they don't drop. You don't feel the door kind of drop down. That's nice. All right, so let me get the rest of the plastic peeled off of the inside. And I think that's it. So it has some heavily smoked side glass there. Oh, in here is a hardware box. Go ahead and get it out. There we go. Not much in there. It feels pretty light. Yeah. So there's a little user manual. Gemini T PRO. And looks like motherboard screws. Some zip ties. Power supply screws. And some, there's at least one little clip with double-sided tape for some cable management. Of course, a case like this, when you have all glass, your cable management is a little more critical because you don't have a solid metal panel there to sort of hide everything. I will say when you open the door here, all that weight, I can feel it wanting to pull the case over, but I'm sitting on this little turntable, so normally you're not going to have the case sitting on a turntable like that. We got these panels here. It says push. Oh, that's nice. Push again. Okay. That is cool. So your front intake panels have these little push detents. So looks like these pop in like that. Oh, that's nice. I like that. That is sweet. Push those two. That I like. So they just pop back in. And looking across the top, the I/O here, there's a USB 3.1 port, single port. We've got a couple of USB 3.0s, a microphone jack, headphone jack. Over here is a button that I'm sure is to cycle through your RGB features. And over here is your power button. Other than that, everything else looks pretty clean. Now the top here is not vented, but it is vented along the sides. So if you open this, you can see that whole section there on both sides. That is vented. And when you close the door, You can see it's not really, the glass is not up against it, so it's sort of blocking it a little, but you can still get air to move through there. So you can see there's a pretty good gap. And it's the same on both sides if you look. So you can see that's all vented along there. And if we look at the back of the case, this is open right here. I can kind of look down through there. And the back, you've got the 120 millimeter fan. Now it is on slots so that the fan can slide down in case we've got anything going on like a radiator and fans at the top that might interfere, so this fan is adjustable. We've got the usual 7 slots for your PCIe, and then there's the tunnel there for the power supply. And I should probably flip this thing over so we can look at the bottom. Alright, so I have the case actually sitting on the back. I've got it turned up 90 degrees. I do not recommend doing this yourself, because if you accidentally open one of these doors, since they don't really latch, that door will just absolutely fly open and come crashing down. So I'm going to be very, very careful here. But looking at the bottom, we've got 4 rubber feet, sort of trapezoid shaped at the bottom. And here is your bottom intake vent across the bottom of the case, and that sort of explains, remember this little piece that sort of fell out when I was opening it? Well, this is your bottom vent panel, and it has little magnets along the perimeter, and it sort of fits right in there, like about like that. Oh, actually there's some little tabs that it fits under. There we go. Alright, so that's what the bottom looks like. And the case is flipped back over to its normal position, but I also wanted to point out, it looks like this glass sort of bends around, but it's actually 2 pieces. There's a front piece and the side piece, and then there's this little frame that sort of holds these together. So it's actually 2 separate pieces, the same on this side over here. Alright, so when I first opened the door, I noticed that it had this nice sound when it comes in, and there's some magnets somewhere. Well, they were right there in front of me. There's one, if I can get the light just right, there's one right there, and it has a little rubber pad over the top of it, and there's one right there, and there's one at the bottom. So the magnets are holding it shut, and the little rubber foot there, or little rubber pad, gives it that nice quiet sort of a latch, I guess you could call it, but it's not really locked shut. And let's see, I guess really I need to start opening it up, and we'll go over the internals now. And now it's time to take a look inside. And to make that a little easier, I took the glass panel off of this side, and the way to do that, the bottom hinge is not captured, but the top hinge, there's a little screw, this little guy right here, that actually you can see it on this side. There's the screw right there. And when you take that out, it allows you to lift the glass panel here on the side completely off. And I recommend that during a system build, because when the side panels are open, I like the gullwing style, but they kind of get in the way. So I'll actually take the other panel off, and again, this is glass, it's heavy, so be really careful and make sure you have somewhere safe to set it when you do take it off. And again, this just lifts up and off the hinge, and I'll set it off to the side, being very careful. And now the chassis here is a little more manageable. And I'll try to strip the chassis down here as much as I can. This whole plastic top piece should pop off. There's some little clips in there that I can dislodge. Sometimes these things pop right off, and sometimes they are a royal pain to get off there, but I'll see if I can get that off here a little later. But looking inside, you can see there's a power supply shroud, and it is removable. You take this little fastener out here, and there are a couple little places that you push there, and this whole section comes out, so I'll take it out here in a minute. So you can see the included 120 millimeter fan in the front there. It's the VB120. Actually, there's another part number below it. And it's a 12 volt fan. For anyone interested, it is a 3-pin fan. And the same for the rear exhaust fan. It is also a 3-pin connector there for the rear fan. So some of the interesting features here, you'll notice there are 2 brackets right here that stick out or stick into the case. And these are for mounting. You can really mount fans there if you want, but it's really for a radiator, a 240 millimeter or a 120. You can mount it there. Now, if you want to do a front radiator, you certainly can. Everything will exist from this face here into the case. There's no room on the front, so it's not like you can pop this front fascia off and put a radiator there. It has to be mounted right here. And when you do that, you can see there's a notch down here. There's a cutout to allow room for a radiator and your fans. And when you do that, this bracket here has to be removed. In fact, both of these brackets, let's see if the other one is screwed on or riveted on. Okay, so this bracket is riveted on and this bracket here is screwed on, which means you can remove this one and this one stays attached. And the reason you'd remove this one is if you're going to put a radiator and your fans there, you need to get rid of this bracket because it gets in the way. As far as a top radiator goes, you can see there is room up there for up to a 360 millimeter top radiator, and I'll sort of do some fitting in there and see where the radiator fits best. I've got a 360 millimeter Cougar all-in-one system to install. It's actually that unit right there, so we'll get that one installed. And that unit should fit quite nicely in the top or the front, either one. But looking at the back here, again, we've got the slots here that are available for a vertical GPU if you want to go that route. And if I get this GPU shroud out of here, or actually PSU, power supply, it's not for a GPU, it's for a PSU. And some people really like these because they sort of give you a place to stash any extra cables underneath, so it makes your cable management a little cleaner. Other people like to show off their power supply, so if you have a really nice power supply that you want to show off, well, when you use the shroud here, you can't see it. But at least Cougar gives you the option to remove it altogether if you choose. Now over here you see there's a hard drive cage, and there are 2, actually let me spin this around. There are 2 hard drive trays. These are plastic trays, and you can see they've got mounting provisions here for a smaller 2.5-inch drive, like a solid state drive if you want, or you can use a regular 3.5-inch drive. And then you can see that this is, let's see, this is riveted in, so this cage is not removable. At least it's not intended to be removable. So your options for hard drives here, you've got, again, these 2 plastic trays, so you can put a couple of hard drives in there, slide them in this little hard drive cage, but you also have these 3, and those screws are in there pretty good. I can get at least one of them out here. These little brackets are for your solid state drive, so if you want to mount a solid state drive there, clip it onto the back so you got room for 3 of those. Now, I noticed over here in the front, let's see, I noticed some slots here on top of the hard drive cage. It looks like you can, let's see if I'm right, yep. So if you want to mount a solid state drive there, you can do it. And you've got the brackets to do it. Alright, so again, looking at the back, there's a pretty generous opening here for the back of the motherboard access if you're going to put a cooler in there. If you need to change a cooler later, you don't have to take the motherboard out. Nice rubber grommet here for your cables to pass through. Some openings down here for some more cables to pass through. Another thing that I always check for on a case is you've got to have an opening somewhere in this corner, because when you have your motherboard installed, you need to get a power cable through for your CPU. There's always a power plug on your motherboard for that, so it looks like they've got you covered there, and it looks big enough to get your cables through. I've seen some where the opening here is so small you can't hardly get your cables through. And while I'm on the subject of fishing cables through there, if you use an all-in-one liquid cooler, then usually your pump is over here and there's nothing covering this area up, so getting cables through there after you have your motherboard and cooler installed are no big deal. But if you use a very large air cooler that usually takes up this whole section, if you forget to fish those cables through there and get them plugged into your motherboard, well, a lot of times you have to take your air cooler back off, so just remember to have your cable routing sort of planned out ahead of time. Now there is one thing I noticed here. If you look at the bottom of the chassis floor here, the floor of the case, you'll see these little threaded holes, tapped holes in parallel. And usually what that's for, if it was toward the front of the case, I would say it was for possibly a pump bracket for a custom cooling loop. A lot of times you'll see a series of holes there for that, but what I think this was for is a bracket possibly for a power supply support, since it's so close to the power supply, and you can adjust it based on the length of your power supply. The other observation is I see two sets of holes here. Look like they're for a 120 millimeter fan, so that one's covered up back there, and then we have two holes that are offset and possibly for a 140 millimeter fan. And since this hard drive cage is riveted in and it offers support to the back plane here, sometimes you can drill the rivets out, take this cage out, and then you can use these features. However, my guess is they were never intended to be used in this particular case. Sometimes what a manufacturer will do is they'll use a chassis across several product lines, and they may not use all of the features in that chassis, so they just sort of go along for the ride because it's less expensive to have a different, or to use the same chassis across several models than it is to have a completely different one. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I'm just making that observation. If you do try to remove this, you may weaken the back plane there because this is pretty firm, and without this, this might start to flex a little more. So leave it in there. All right, the other thing I notice is the bottom is very generously vented there, so you've got a lot of opportunity for air to be pulled in from the bottom of the case. And I'll also say that there is no mention at all of a pump bracket, fans in the bottom, taking this out. Nothing like that in any of the literature or the manual, so it's just an observation of mine as I'm taking a look at the case in more detail. So I think we're pretty much ready to go ahead and get the system build rolling here. I think I will see if this top comes off very easily. Alright, so I'm popping, you can see these fit into these holes right here, and they're pretty stiff, so this thing did not want to come out. It kind of put up a little bit of a fight, but I'm always a little paranoid when I take these plastic panels off because they're so easy to, you can break them if you're not careful, if you get a little carried away. So there's the front, and the reason you need to really take this off is when you mount your any fans or a radiator to the back side here, you need to be able to get the screws in, so you do have to pull that front fascia off. And the same goes for this top piece. The more I look at it, that'll have to come off there. I already tried once, and it's also pretty stubborn, so I'll give it another shot. Alright, so it took a little bit of pushing, but I did get the whole panel here to pop off, and you do need to do that to get access to all the holes there if you do put a top mounted radiator or any fans. And there's no clearance on top here for a fan or radiator. It all has to be mounted underneath. But this did come off. It just put up a little bit of a fight. It's brand new. Everything's kind of stiff and not wanting to comply, but I guess that's better than something being so loose it just falls off. So I guess I'd rather have it on there pretty tight. Okay, so now I think I'm ready for the system build. Now this motherboard tray is nice because one of the studs here, one of the standoffs, has this little pin that sticks out, and that is a centering pin that sort of helps you get the motherboard sort of located. And When you're putting the motherboard in, you always want to make sure that you're not pinching any cables. It's real easy for loose cables to get behind the motherboard. And when you get the motherboard all installed, you realize you've got a cable trapped. The motherboard here is one of the Strix from ASUS. It's a Z390, and the CPU here is a 9900K. I need to get all that old thermal paste off of it. But when you put the motherboard in, usually it's easier if you lay the case flat. I'll be doing it vertically here. You can do it any way you like, but it's usually easier when it's flat. Alright, so I got the motherboard in there, but usually they just pop right in. And this one was fighting back a little bit. Right along this edge here, you can see the fan, the rear exhaust fan, was sort of interfering and not letting the motherboard fully seat into that position. So I had to loosen these two screws and then these two screws on the fan, which allows the fan to sort of move around a little bit there. It's still a little tight, but I had to do that to get the motherboard all the way in there. It was just a little bit snug. And then when you get your fasteners in, don't start the one and then tighten it down. What you want to do is get all of the fasteners started. Right now I just have a couple in there, and then the centering stud right there is what's holding it in. But what you want to do is get all your screws started in each hole, because you need to sometimes shift the motherboard around a little bit to get the holes to line up. And if you put one screw in and then tighten it all the way down right away, well, you'll have trouble sometimes getting the other holes to line up. So get them all started and then tighten them down. One more quick tip, especially for you first-time system builders. When you're using a screwdriver to tighten your motherboard screws, especially a long screwdriver, you got to be really careful, because you can slip and drag that screwdriver across your motherboard, which is not good. You don't want to do that. So I always use two hands when I tighten the fasteners. So I use one to sort of guide it and hold it in position, and tighten with the other one, and that just gives you a little extra safety. Okay, one more tip, and I promise I'll stop. This is an anti-static wrist strap. You see one end is on my wrist, the other end you connect to a source of ground. In the summertime, when the humidity is high, this is usually not a big deal. Static is not usually a problem, but in the winter, or if you live in an environment that just has really low humidity, for a couple dollar investment, less than $5, this can save your electronic devices. So keep that in mind. Motherboard is in. Now it's time for the power supply. This is the GEX 850 from Cougar. It is a fully modular power supply, so that's what we'll be putting in next. So here's the power supply, and I already have the cables connected. And in this particular case, it's not a big deal, since the area here for your power supply is all open. But in some cases where this is all covered, there's a shroud or a metal cover over it, and you can't really get to your power supply very easily. Usually this section back here is actually open, so you get into it from the back of the case. Anyway, I say all that because most power supplies now, I should say a lot of power supplies, are going modular or partially modular. And you want to go ahead and sort of map out which cables you want to use now and get them plugged in before you put the power supply in, because it can be very difficult to get to these little plugs and get them plugged in once the power supply is installed in the case. Now this particular case, it's not a big deal because everything is going to be accessible, and the shroud here is so easy to remove, it's not a big deal, but just keep that in mind. And now the decision is to either I go with fan up or fan down on the power supply. So if it's fan up, of course it'll just pull air in from inside the case. If I go with fan down, which is probably the way most people go, then your fan is of course down and it's pulling air in from the floor of the case. And of course there's plenty of vented area there to do that. Now, I used to put mine fan up from time to time, because that way I could see the fan. That's of course if you can see the power supply from within the case, but that way I could always tell that the fan was working. But with 0 RPM power supplies now, a lot of times the fans don't run until they need to, so there's really no advantage necessarily to putting it with the fan up. And the bad thing with the fan up is you have to be very careful that you don't drop any screws or fan clips or anything down in here, especially during installation. So probably the best way to do it is fan down, which is the way I'll do it. And sort of like I said earlier, if you get your cables already figured out which ones you need, this case is not a big deal because you can access them, but other cases it's more difficult. once you get the power supply installed. So I will go ahead and get this mounted, and then I'll get everything connected. And of course, if you're going with an air cooler, this is the main power for the CPU. And if you're going with an air cooler, it'll block this area and make this particular cable, or it can make it difficult to connect. Now, for anyone wondering, I already reviewed this, so you can check out the review. So I won't really be talking a whole lot about this cooler since we are focusing on the case. So let's get this thing installed and get things rolling. All right, so I've got the radiator, sort of a quick test fit. And keep in mind there's no room for any fans up here on top. As you can see the contour of the bottom, it pretty much sits almost on top. And there's room for air. So the fans push the air up and out of these side vents. But there is no room up there for any fan or fans. And it looks like I've got plenty of room everywhere else in here to get the fans in here. Now, when you do the actual install, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and get the fans attached to the bottom of the radiator first, because some of those screws will be difficult to get to if you put the radiator in and then try to put the fans in. So I'll pop the radiator back out and get the fans attached. All right, so I got the radiator in there, but it was not without a little bit of a struggle. You can see I had to drop the fan down almost a little bit past the halfway mark on the slot there, so that it would clear the fan right here at the back. But that's where the problem was. So if you look back here, you see this little plastic shroud, and this sticks up just high enough that it interferes with the back of this fan, and it was almost impossible to get it in there. I had to really push. So it depends on the motherboard. Not all motherboards are going to have a plastic shroud like that. If I were starting from scratch again, I would probably see what it involved to get this plastic shroud off of there. Of course, you lose some of your LED effects, and this will probably vary from motherboard to motherboard, but you need to take that into consideration. I was able to make it work, but it's an awful tight fit. All right, hard to do that with one hand, so I had to put the camera down real quick. So anyway, now that's connected. So we have the case, the chassis, and the pump connected, but we still have the fans. And the fans actually have their own, they're actually, let's see, this is the fan speed and power. Okay, so this connector right here, each fan has its own connector, and then you can daisy chain the fans together. And ultimately this wire here goes back to the pump. So the pump actually has another lead that comes off to control the RGB for the fans. So that way you have synchronization between the pump, the fans, and the chassis. Alright, so they give you, for your USB connectors, for your USB 3.0 and the 3.1, they give you the same sort of plugs, which is fine if your motherboard has the right sockets for these, but as you can see, I only have one socket right there for USB 3.0 or 3.1. Alright, so everything is pretty much in there where it needs to be and connected. Now I'm going to put the graphics card in a moment. I'm actually going to use the vertical slots right here. So these knockouts, these are sort of a one-time knockout. Once they're knocked out, they're pretty much out, I believe. And in order to use the vertical GPU, I have to use one of these. This is the remote Pcie connector. This one here is from Fractal Design, although there are several manufacturers, and this one is the Flex VRC-25. So you can look that up if you're interested in one of these. Like I said, there are other manufacturers, but I've used this one several times and it works out quite well. But basically this end here plugs into your PCIe slot, and that basically extends your PCIe slot to somewhere else. Now the only thing, some of the cases I've used have some mounting provisions down here for the holes that you see here, one over here on the left and then one or two up here on the right, to sort of secure this or anchor it to the floor of the case, or at least on top of the power supply shroud. And we don't have that here, so what we're relying on to secure the card will just be the two anchor points really up at the top. Alright, so I'll knock these out. These little holes here are usually so you can get a screwdriver or something in there. And don't be afraid to bend them a little bit, because they're going to be thrown away. So you're not really worried about damaging them. So usually you get them sort of worked back and forth a little, and they're like connected real loosely at the top, and you're just trying to break that little connection. And once you do, these things usually, I say usually, but they usually pop out. And you want to be real careful. There you go. Once you get it bent a little, you can work it back and forth, and then they come out. And on the back is this little cover here that gets removed so that I can get these two loose, so the graphics card can be locked into position. And now I take the little remote PCIe card, and one end plugs in here to your PCIe slot. Now the other end, like I said, usually it would sort of bolt in position here so that it's not just loose there, but we'll see how secure it is. So we attach it to the bottom of the graphics card. And this is an old GTX 770, which I know by today's standards is a Model T, but it gets the job done. Alright, so that is in there. So it's really locked into the bottom of the two slots, and then it's secured at the top here with these fasteners. So one goes in there like that, and we'll put both in. Even though one could probably hold it, we'll still put both of them in there. And we'll see how loose it is. Alright, so, you know, I mean, it can move around a little, but that's actually not too bad. Not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Actually, it's pretty good. And then we get the power connected, so I need to use 1 8 and then 1 6. And there's not a whole lot I can do with the leftover cable, but I'll get it tucked away as best I can here. Alright, now some people will mention the fact that this intake fan here, this is a reference style card, and it has the blower. There's not a lot of room here, so when you get the side doors on, there really is not a lot of room for intake. However, it doesn't take a lot to get air in here, and since this is a reference style card, any heat that's generated by the card, I should say most of the heat, is being pushed right out the back of the case here, which is really good because that's where you want the heat, outside and not inside the case. Your cards that have your 2 fans or 3 fans right here, they will just cycle the heat that is generated by the card within the case. So if you don't have a good set of fans to get the heat out of the case, then that heat tends to stay in the case, whereas with this style card, it gets pushed out. Now, is there enough room here? I'm not too worried about it. I've run a couple in this situation that were pretty shallow, and they seem to function fine. Again, they were with reference cards, and some larger cards. This is actually fairly small, again, by today's standards. They will stick out even further, and I don't know, you may be starving the fans a little bit, but in this case, I think I'm okay. And I put the glass on, and actually the glass does not sit, it doesn't sit right up against the case. There's a little bit of a gap, probably close to a 1/4 inch gap. So the glass is actually a little further away from the blower than it looks. It's not right up against it. Alright, so I got the top snapped on there. Now I just need to try and get the front fascia popped back on, and there we go. So close that door. Now this side's going to be a little more sensitive to your cable management since it doesn't positively latch, so I'm going to have to work on my cable stuff there a little more to get that side to close. And after the doors are put back on the hinges, don't forget to put these little screws back. I got one more to put on that side to keep your doors from coming off. Now the doors aren't going to just fly right off, but if you went to move the case or try to pick it up and your doors aren't secured here, that would not be good. And let's see, oh, I got the little cover back over the GPU mounting there also. All right, so you can see the motherboard has power to it, and this is the moment where you cross your fingers and hope everything works. Let's see, is this the power button? No, it must be this one. There we go. And there it is. And I'll play around with the RGB stuff here in a moment and see if I can make some changes there. So next, I'll go ahead and put a little bit of heat into the case. I'll stress test the system and look at the thermal camera and see what the case looks like. So it's doing some fan tuning right now. Since it's a new case, new fans, the system has to tune them to work optimally. Now I did figure out how to control the color of the pump head there, the fans, and the case itself. You can coordinate that, and it really comes down to you have to hold this button here and wait for the pump head to flash, and then you're basically handing off control to the case. So now everything is synchronized. It's in like a rainbow mode right now. And if I hit the button, so now it's red, although the light in the room kind of washes out some of the colors. But now it's in, let's see, it's just sort of cycling through the colors. So you can see the case and the pump head. If I can get this on here, and the fans are all synchronized together. And if I hit the button here again, we can sort of cycle through some of the color modes. So there's kind of a green. And then if I hit the button again, sort of an aqua, light green, blue. And then eventually, there I can shut it off altogether if I don't want the case lights or the cooler on. And of course, you can coordinate all that with the motherboard, but that's some software that's controlled by the motherboard. And then we're back to the rainbow. Now, as far as airflow, before I've done any of the thermal testing, I can say there's a fair gap around the front here. It's a little hard to see, but you can see it here maybe a little better. There's a gap that that's where your front air intake is going to come in along the bottom of the glass here too. So even though this is sort of covered, you've got airflow that can come in through there. Exhaust air, this whole section here is open. Even though the glass overlaps it a little bit, there's still a gap. And I can feel air coming out even though the fans aren't really cranked up just yet. And then over here, we've got a little bit of room for air to come out. This huge panel here at the back fan is, of course, vented. And then the rest of the PCIe slots, those all have holes for air to come out too. So even though there's nothing on the top for air to come out, it looks like the rest of the case, they did a pretty good job. So let's get the thermals going. And before I do the thermal testing, I've got my decibel meter here, which you can see is going crazy because I'm talking. But I'll walk around the case here and we'll look at the decibel readings. Now I have the fans cranked all the way up. Keep in mind there's a radiator in the top. So depending upon your fan configuration, your sound is going to be a little different. So the front of the case, again, there's only one stock fan in the front. And then we'll come around to the side here. And then we'll come around to the back. Now if I go ahead and bring the fan noise down to a normal level, you can see it drops quite a bit. Now again, if you had a big air cooler in there and no fans at the top, and of course the stock fan is right here in the middle, the 120 millimeter fan, your sound's going to be a little different. It all depends on how your system is set up. So let's take a look inside. Again, the fans are cranked all the way up. And the card's a little warm, but it's not bad. I think there's enough of a gap there between the fan intake and the glass that we're not starving the graphics card there for air. So I'll get the thermal camera out now and see what things look like. Alright, so we got the thermal camera fired up here. You can see the heat on the top of the case, especially there at the exhaust vents. We're not seeing like an excessive amount of heat, but you can see where the heat is concentrated and where it's exiting. And looking across the front here, the colors just mean there's a temperature differential. They're not necessarily an indicator of an actual temperature. Now there's a lot of reflection off the glass here. And then looking at the back of the case, again, you can definitely see that little opening there. There's a lot of warm air coming out of there. There's the rear exhaust fan. And down below here, we should see some heat on the graphics card. And probably some down here on the power supply. And we'll take a quick look at the inside of the case. Of course, no surprises there. The VRM is the hottest part on the motherboard, but you can see the two coolant lines that go up to the radiator, and you can definitely see which one is carrying the warmer coolant away from the CPU up to the radiator, and then that one there is the return line back to the pump. So now I think I'll take the radiator from the top and put it in the front, see if that makes any differences on the cooling performance. The test system here is the Asus Z390 Strix motherboard with a 9900K CPU, overclocked to 4.9 gigahertz, and I use AIDA64 to do all my stress testing. And with the overclock at 4.9 gigahertz, I actually hit over 80 degrees Celsius, and I thought that didn't sound right because I tested this cooler not too long ago outside of the case, and it was quite a bit lower. It was around 56, 57 degrees Celsius, if I remember. Of course, with the radiator at the top, and when you're in a case, your airflow will be a little different, so I would expect the temperature to be a little higher, but not 80 degrees Celsius. So I loosened the bolts there, the fasteners on the pump, pulled the pump off a little bit, and then reseated it. I didn't touch the thermal paste, and now my temperatures are between 70 and 72 Celsius, so that's considerably lower, and about what I expect to see from that radiator in a case. It would be a little higher than what I got before, but not that high. So anyway, what I'll do next is move the radiator from the top to the front and see if there's any difference in the temperature. Well, I have the radiator dropped from the top. I'm in the process of flipping the fans around. I have the top fan flipped around. I got to get the other two flipped. And it will ultimately mount here in the front. Of course, it goes behind this piece. And then I had to take this little bracket here. If you recall earlier, there are the two brackets. There's one on this side, one on this side. And this is so you can mount a 240 millimeter radiator in that space there. But it has to come out if we put a radiator in the front. All right, we got the radiator mounted in the front. Of course, I don't have the front cover on there, so the LEDs are pretty intense. But I'll get everything buttoned up and then we'll do some thermal testing. So the overclock is at 4.9 gigahertz and the stress test is running, but I thought I'd take a quick look here. I popped the front filter out here, this little filter piece, off of one side just to see what sort of restriction there was behind there, and there really isn't any. So there's plenty of space here in these openings to get air in. And I noticed there is a little bit of a gap at the top of this particular radiator, so you might be recycling a little bit of the case air from inside and drawing it back through the radiator, but that shouldn't be a real big deal. And then the little fan that was in the front, I moved it to the top. That's the fan that was in the front here originally. So I'll continue with the thermal testing. Alright, so the overclock's been running a little while and I am seeing temperatures between 68 and 70 Celsius, so that tells me that the radiator in the front, pulling in cool air from the front, does knock a couple of degrees off of your temperatures. So it may be the fact that there's a little less restriction trying to push air out through the top when the radiator's in the top. Hard to say exactly what it is, but you do get a little better thermal results with the radiator in the front. Now, another thing to consider here, when you mount a graphics card like this, you've got plenty of room if your graphics card is longer than this one. And this particular card, and again, this is a GTX 770, this is roughly 270 millimeters long. If you put a graphics card in here horizontally, like you would normally do in that top slot there, you are limited, if we measure here, to this little fan bracket here where my thumb is. You've got about 275 millimeters. So, depending upon what graphics card you use, you need to make sure it will clear this bracket if you want to mount it in the horizontal position. Vertical, you have a little more freedom. Again, you have to consider the air intake though. For this graphics card, I don't think it's a big deal, but other graphics cards, if they stick out a little more, they're going to be closer to the glass, so you may have a little bit of a restriction. So, just things to consider. Alright, so here's a quick bonus. I was getting ready to actually tear the system down because the review was all done. And I thought, you know, I should probably show a radiator on the side mount there, because I know people would be interested in that. Now, I don't have any Cougar 240 millimeter radiators. All I have is a 280, and of course it won't fit there. So I'm using the H100 I Pro from Corsair. Now, it would look a lot nicer if I had some RGB fans in there. But the only thing I'll say is that the brackets, if you recall earlier, those brackets that sort of stick, protrude out into the case, I thought the radiator and the fans would have fit in that, and I'll show you what I mean here. Let me open the other side. I would have thought that the radiator would have fit within this space right here, but it's actually too wide. And that may be the intent. It just looked to me like it would fit in there, but it doesn't, and the fans don't either. And this is about as bread and butter vanilla of a system, you know, radiator as far as dimensions as you can get. So that may be the way it was intended all along. The user manual, it's a little hard to really figure out exactly where the radiator goes, but it does fit and it looks fine in there. It just kind of sticks out into the case a little bit, and again with some RGB fans it would look even nicer. So there you go. So overall, I like the case. I really like the gullwing doors. That's kind of a neat effect. I did have a little bit of trouble getting that radiator in at the top. So even though it says it supports it, you want to do some test fitting and make sure first. Radiator in the front, no problem at all. And if you do put a 240 there in the back, again, no problem. So as for pricing, right now on Amazon, I saw it for like $232. And you know how Amazon is with pricing. It's usually all over the map, but I did see it on Newegg for like $167, and I think that's probably more in alignment with a decent value for a case with this feature set. Overall though, I would give this, I'm kind of torn between the silver and the gold award, but it does have enough nice features that'll kind of push it there towards the gold. So I would give this the Overclockers Club Gold Award. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.